Let's play licensed Game Boy Advance games. I have 3 Game Boy Advances for some reason.
If you're somehow not aware, the Game Boy Advance had a big problem with shovelware pumped onto the thing, and the vast majority of them were based on existing intellectual property. Today we're going to be looking at some of the Game Boy Advance games that I had as a kid. Maybe a couple that I wanted at the time and didn't get my hands on until later, but that will remain the point of focus. Let's start off with my first Game Boy Advance games, Monsters Incorporated and Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Monsters Inc., truth be told, is actually a pretty decent affair. Each world starts with a monster shredding Boo's door and scattering the door pieces into different levels. The game has you explore each environment looking for all of the pieces in a given level in order to progress. You also have a map of each level. On easy, it will show you where everything is, but on higher difficulties, the specific contents will be replaced with question marks. The sprite art is very good, and the music, while still very clearly Game Boy Advance music, suits the material well and can be pretty catchy at points. You might also notice that the voice clips are taken directly from Monsters Incorporated's Scream Team, or Scare Island as it's otherwise known.
Alright, yeah! Alright, yeah!
Actually, can we talk about this for a second? Because this has been bugging me for way too long. On the PlayStation 1, the game is called Scream Team in North America, Monster Academy in Japan, and Scare Island in PAL regions. So far, pretty typical. However, I, a little American sausage, had the game on PC as a kid, and there it was just called Scare Island. This would make some sense if the game was of European origin, and they just used the PAL name across the board for the PC version for more universal branding, but the game was developed by A2M, who were based in Quebec.
Je suis fromage. Omelette du fromage. Mercredius Lundian soup et mon frère un poisson. La soupe nouillère flambée. Usne null says the crème. Hehe.
What the hell was I talking about? Alright, Harry Potter. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone is an overhead adventure game where you explore Hogwarts, learn different spells, and solve puzzles with those spells. It's more or less what you'd expect from a Harry Potter game. The character models are all pre-rendered, but it appears that they're taken from the PC Sorcerer's Stone game that was released around the same time. But yeah, it's the typical Harry Potter affair. You can run around the castle, sneak through it at night, and so on. The one weird thing is that you don't learn the spells through a spell book, as is typical in these games. You learn the spell through a wand dance battle. So those first few games were pretty alright. Now it's time to tip the scales. When I got my Game Boy Advance for Christmas in 2001, one of the key games I wanted was Mario Kart Super Circuit. I didn't get it. However, later I did get Shrek Swamp Kart Speedway. Oh hey, this game uses musics. Who knows, maybe this game will be more impressive than you'd think. The sound's gotta be good for sure. For those of you who don't know, Musix was a sound tool developed by Factor 5 for a variety of different platforms to get better sound than what was natively available on each respective system. Aside from the GameCube, where Musix was more natively integral. In fact, the Harry Potter game we were just playing earlier used the Game Boy Advance version of Musix, and one of the games that we're going to play later, Star Wars The New Droid Army, also uses it, and take a listen to it. I did not edit a recording of the Star Wars theme there. That is actually how the game sounds. You can look it up. Whereas here... You know, I don't really feel that the Game Boy player really deserves this game. No, we'll be using this thing instead. Introducing the Advanced Game Port. Imagine playing Game Boy Advance titles in full screen on your television. Now you can. Yes, indeed you can, if you define full screen as framed and decidedly not full screen. AGP works with hundreds of Game Boy Advance titles, including Pokemon Ruby Sapphire, Mario Advance, Zelda the Four Swords, and many, many more. They just might sound like this. Yay, it sounds even worse now. Well, aside from joking about this game's auditory deficiencies, the game itself is pretty dreadful. The frame rate is pretty low, though admittedly the advanced game port certainly doesn't help matters. The handling is pretty bad, the AI is bizarrely unrelenting, and the correlation between the visual representation of what power-up you pick up and how it actually functions is honestly pretty nonsensical. Thankfully there's a practice mode, which is basically exactly like the main game, except here everything is unlocked, so there's no real point in playing the game normally. So with that discovery, let's move on. Let's try out Finding Nemo, but before we do, I need to get this off my chest. If you have a retro game store near you that has a bargain bin or basket or bucket filled with Game Boy Advance games, here's a little game you can play, and this one's free. Count how many Finding Nemo cartridges there are. I swear, every time I go to one, I at least find 3 at a given time. I think I've seen more copies of this game lying around than literally any other video game.
You can never escape. You can never escape the Finding Nemo.
This was developed by Vicarious Visions, who is recently known for the Crash Bandicoot Insane trilogy, but has been doing port work for years, such as the GameCube and Xbox version of Jedi Outcast, as well as the Xbox version of Doom 3. Their output on the Game Boy Advance, on the other hand, both amazes and terrifies me. If you grew up with the Game Boy Advance, you at least had a few of their games, as they made close to 40 licensed games. They made that many games on one system in just 7 years, while also producing titles for other systems around the same time. That said, this game is actually pretty good looking, and the music is also pretty well done. Vicarious Visions often had help in the sound department from Shinen, the guys who did Iridian 3D and recently Fast RMX. The mechanics and game feel are actually remarkably faithful to the console game by Traveler's Tales. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the character sprites were just using that game's models and animation as pre-rendered graphics. But yeah, this game is basically underwater levels the video game, but for that the game is actually not too bad in most regards. It controls well, there's some nice use of escalation in the design, and they even put in the chase sections akin to the console game. However, some of the levels, in particular some of the tube-based ones, can get pretty aggravating, and it seems that the developers love Switch puzzles way too much. Also, there's a memory minigame at the end of each stage, and the sound effects in this minigame have served as the basis for many inside jokes amongst the people I know who've played this game. Up next is... oh dear god.
3D mode, board game. 3D mode, board game. Testing the game.
Thankfully, this game doesn't bear much resemblance to the console game, and the world is better for it. This game was developed by Humansoft, who also did Pac-Man Pinball Advance, and the impressive, albeit not very playable, Nintendo DS port of Pac-Man World 3. By selecting the tutorial, we first see that we can not only play as Jimmy, but also Goddard. Okay, let's move on and actually play the game. Oh no, the Yokians have stolen our parents, yet you look really distraught about it. The game is actually pretty open. You can explore Retroville trying to find pieces to build your rocket, which are scattered across town. It kind of reminds me of Star Wars for the NES to provide some form of comparison. Why wasn't the console game like this? Like, the game isn't fantastic or even that good, but at least meets realistic expectations. Again, unlike... So if it hasn't been made abundantly clear on this channel, I am obsessed with Star Wars, and have been since a young age. As such, as a kid, I played almost every Star Wars game to come out for the Game Boy Advance. So with that, let's get started. Star Wars Flight of the Falcon is an arcade-style 3D flight game, and a pretty infamous one at that. It shows up pretty often on lists of the worst Star Wars games and worst Game Boy Advance games, but honestly, I don't think it really deserves it. It's choppy, but for a 3D game on the Game Boy Advance of this scale, you kinda have to expect that. Some levels are worse at this than others, and it does become hard to discern what's going on in levels like the Endor Force, where it basically becomes a slideshow, but a lot of the time, it's reasonable enough. My main problem with the game, though, is the difficulty, and I'm not typically one to complain about difficulty. My issue isn't even a matter of cheap enemy placement, usage of hazards, or anything more conventional. It's the time constraints. This game holds you on a tight leash, and granted, this sort of thing can be done well, but what you're expected to accomplish in the time allotted is friggin' ludicrous, and just overall unrealistic. I'll be honest, when I played this game as a kid, I mostly just used cheat codes and skipped around to what levels I could actually play, because the difficulty curve in this game is really sporadic. As a kid, I loved this game because it was the closest thing I had to Rogue Leader and Rebel Strike on the go. Upon retrospect, this game really isn't that great, but again, I don't think it's quite as bad as others make it out to be. No, if you want a bad Star Wars game, play Attack of the Clones. This is a beat-em-up, I guess, where you walk around really slowly and swing at things with your lightsaber. In order to use your lightsaber, you hold down the A button, which brings you to a complete stop, then you use the D-pad to swing the lightsaber in that direction. Not only is this as awkward as pick-up lines about how much the person you love doesn't remind you of sand, but there isn't much in the way of varying enemy vulnerabilities. As long as you can hit an enemy with a lightsaber, you're good. There's very little you can do in the way of defensive options, and the whole stop dead in your tracks when using the lightsaber mechanic only makes you more of a sitting duck open to enemy attack, but at the same time you're such a large target anyway that it's going to be the case anyway. I don't really have to go into too much more detail because that's essentially the game. There's the occasional thing to mix the gameplay up, but most of the time it's just this. Have fun. The weird thing too is that Nintendo used this game in their ads for the Game Boy Advance. Like, hey, buy our handheld consoles. It has great games like Star Wars Attack of the Clones. Now let's move on to Star Wars The New Droid Army. This game is an isometric adventure game, and it actually isn't terrible. Like I mentioned earlier, it sounds incredible and amazingly authentic to the films thanks to the music's technology being used correctly. But what's less faithful is the plot and world building. This game takes place shortly after the events of Attack of the Clones and before Revenge of the Sith. In the last level of this game, you kill Count Dooku. I will repeat that. You kill Count Dooku. Not in Palpatine's company. Do it. Not on the Invisible Hand, not above Coruscant, not as the Clone Wars are about to end, but just in some droid factory on some industrial planet, as the Clone Wars are basically just starting. And yes, I get it, Revenge of the Sith wasn't out yet, but did they really not think that the big new villain from the last movie wasn't going to return? Unlike Darth Maul, he wasn't cut in half or anything, and even then, that didn't stop Maul from returning either. Well, time to have fun with this and make it even less accurate. I'm going to kill him as Luke. God, I miss cheat codes. Lastly, let's talk about Revenge of the Sith. Similar to the Attack of the Clones game, this game is a beat-em-up focused primarily on lightsaber combat. However, unlike Attack of the Clones, this game is actually really damn good. I'm generally not the biggest fan of beat-em-ups, so when I say that I actually had a lot of fun with this game, that should say something. Mechanically, this game hits every mark that you'd want it to. There's a ton of moves you can do with the lightsaber that are not only intuitive to pull off, but also yield different impacts depending on the situation. There's actually some strategy to this. You also have a variety of defensive options, a meter that gradually fills that will eventually allow you to pull off more powerful moves until that meter is fully drained, and then there are upgradable force powers. Plus, there are also 2 story modes. You can follow the movie's events from either Anakin's or Obi-Wan's perspective, and each character has different force powers than the other. There's actually some decent environment variety with destructible surroundings, often with goodies inside, and the action is fast-paced and varied enough to keep the game interesting throughout its duration. I never felt like I was just pressing the same button over and over again until I was allowed to move again. I felt constantly engaged. It doesn't really feel like it's really imitating Final Fight, Streets of Rage, or other games of the genre, but it still does everything right. So those are all of the licensed Game Boy Advance games I'm going to cover today. So what can I say about them as a whole? In retrospect, a lot of them are pretty hard to go back to. However, for the kid in the early 2000s on the go, or with the Game Boy Advance as their only option for playing video games, there were better things to be playing for sure, but they were fine enough. A nice alternative to staring at the backs of your parents' heads as the smell of melting crayons looms in the hot air in your parents' late 90s or early 2000s car.